Isn't it funny how kids like to collect things? Now, I don't know what you guys collected, but when I was a kid, I collected basketball cards relentlessly. I loved them. I couldn't get enough. As soon as I made a little bit of money, the first thing that I did was I went down to the local store and I bought a pack of cards. And I sifted through them in hopes of finding the Holy Grail, but I rarely got it. And so what I realized was that the more that I played basketball, the more that I learned about the game, the more that I recognized the great college players coming up, and that I could find an Allen Iverson, who by his second year, I could trade one of his cards for 2 Charles Barkleys. And if I had 2 Charles Barkleys, I could combine that with a Scottie Pippen, and maybe, just maybe, I could get the Holy Grail, a Michael Jordan basketball card, right? And so I did this throughout my entire childhood. And eventually I started to share with my coaches that I loved picking these cards and finding the great players and kind of trading up from one to the other. And at one point, one of my coaches pulled me aside and he said, Adam, you realize that I do this for a career. It's called picking stocks. And at that point in time, I became obsessed. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to work on Wall Street. And from that point forward, I had one singular mission. It was to become an investment banker. So I was 13, I opened up an E-Trade account. When I was 16, I found a job at a hedge fund in town. By the time I was 19, I was working at a fund of funds, and I was on a fast track to a lucrative Wall Street career. But there was something inside of me that said, maybe you should yearn for something a little different. I just had this craving to get outside of my comfort zone. And I hope that you guys recognize what I'm talking about. You just have this thing that kind of calls you late at night. I call it the restless voice that keeps us up. But it said to me more than anything, get out of your comfort zone. It's only when you're outside of your comfort zone that you'll start to discover not what you are, but who you are. And so I started to travel when I was 21, and I had a series of incredibly profound experiences. The most powerful of which was in India, the place that I was hoping to get to most. And I had a habit of asking one child in each country that I went to, what do you want most in the world? And I thought their answers would be the things that I wanted. A big house, a fast car, a cool boat, a Michael Jordan basketball card maybe. But when I got to India, where the poverty was just the most devastating that I had ever seen in my entire life, I found this boy who was begging on the streets. And I asked him, if you could have anything, what would you want? And his answer was a pencil. Nothing more, nothing less, just simply a pencil. And I had a pencil with me, and I gave him my pencil, and he just lit up. And I realized that for the very first time in my life, I had met somebody who had absolutely no access to any form of education. He had seen other children coming home from school every single day, carrying a pencil, a pen, a notepad. And yet this boy was one of what are now 57 million children around the world who lack any form of educational access. And I knew that I needed to do something about it. And so I came back and I went through investment banking and consulting interviews, and I landed what in my mind was the dream job, which was a consulting position at Bain & Company. And when I was at Bain, I finally got up the courage to maybe kind of stick my foot in the water of what I was most passionate about, which was this education issue. And so I went to the bank one day, and I said, I have this idea. I want to start this organization called Pencils of Promise, because I've always passed out pens and pencils as I backpacked through 40, 50 countries. And the woman behind the desk at the bank said, well, I really like the name. I said, me too. It sounds kind of nice, Pencils of Promise. I like it. She said, well, you have to start with at least $25 to open up a bank account at Bank of America. And I thought, well, that's a good sign. I'm turning 25 this month. And so I put $25 into a bank account in October of 2008 in hopes of building one school. And with that one school, I could dedicate it and honor my 80-year-old grandmother who was a Holocaust survivor, and I could make sure that her legacy was carried forward for generations. And fortunately, I'm born on Halloween, which makes for a pretty good party. And so I asked friends to give donations in lieu of birthday presents, and that helped launch a series of low-dollar events that led to the funding, a little bit more than $25,000 for our very first school. And I found myself in rural Laos. And I turned around one day, we had just broken ground on our very first school in a community called Patong. And I turn around and there's these 3 beautiful girls. And Jasunyong means, what's your name? And Nimdae means smile.
Jasunyong? Nit.
And what you're going to see is the primary school in that village, but the bricks that you're about to see are the preschool, which we were creating. And it kind of hits me in this moment because of their age.
And you're going to be our first preschool students. Yeah, sounds good? All right, I think you guys like it.
And at this point, everything changes. Because it's no longer about me. It's no longer about my relationship with my grandmother. It's actually about these three girls. It's about not the pencils, but the promise. Because I've now made a commitment, an oath to these young girls that they will be our first preschool students. And the word promise actually has a second definition, right? This individual has promise. There's latent potential within them, which is the one thing that education most unlocks. And so it became that much more powerful when about 4 months later, I was able to put up on Facebook this image, which was Nit and Nut now in their very first school, and show to all of my friends that had given small contributions on my birthday that they had actually enabled educational access for these young girls. And so I tried to return to my job at Bain, and I'm sure you guys can guess what happened. I couldn't go back to working on some of the clients as much as I enjoyed the people and the work. I was transfixed with this organization. And more than anything, it didn't make me happy. It gave me purpose. And there's a huge difference there. And so I started to think about how do we transfer the way that we look at this type of work? Because I've never been interested in charity. I want to solve issues. I want these girls to have access to education. I want the boy that I met in the street in India to have access to the same exact education that I got in my phenomenal public school system. And so I started to think about how does this organization, Pencils of Promise, start to change the paradigm by which we view charitable work and ultimately how we solve problems in our world. And so the first thing was to throw out this phrase. Now we're a 501c3, quote, nonprofit, but I've never met a single person in my life who wakes up in the morning and says to themselves, today I cannot wait to not profit. Nobody in the history of the world has said that. And the people that work in this space do so for two reasons. Either they want to lift others out of poverty and bring greater profitability into their life, or they want to increase the sense of meaning in their own. And so I thought, why do we use this terrible term? Why do we put non in front of the description of our work? I would never meet somebody who works at American Airlines and say to them, oh, do you work in the non-automobile industry? Never. That would never happen. And yet we use this term non to define ourselves. And so the first thing was to change the language. And I really believe in this idea. You change your words to change your worth. So we changed the language, said we're not a nonprofit, we're going to consider ourselves a for-purpose organization, and that every other organization in the space should take this same approach to maximize impact instead of minimizing resources. And what I saw was an overwhelming reaction, because the first time that I delivered that statement, it was on stage at the Google Zeitgeist conference in 2011, looking out at a full room, hundreds of leading male and female executives from some of the greatest companies on earth, looking at me at the time, a 26-year-old, saying, we're not a nonprofit, we're a for-purpose. And I've only found one image that aptly captures their facial expression, which is this one. I gotta credit my friends at Shutterstock for helping me with this one, but it was literally like they had heard something that they had never even known existed. And what blew me away was not the reaction not only from the nonprofit industry, it was the business community that this idea resonated so much with, that we could bring the best elements of for-profit business acumen into the way that we address humanitarian issues. And so Pencils of Promise began to grow by leaps and bounds. And 5 years later, after that very first video was shot in March of 2009, with Nit and Nut and Tamun being our first students in our first school, I'm proud to say that Pencils of Promise has broken ground on more than 200 schools around the world with more than 22,000 students in our programs every single day, which include teacher training and student scholarships and what we call innovation pilots, looking at what the future of education can be. But again, to take a for-purpose approach instead of a nonprofit approach, that would be like me saying to you, I just raised a $10 million hedge fund, and here's all the pretty photos of my team. And look at how nice our office is. You would say, well, how's my money doing? Was it actually used impactfully? Which is, again, what this space needs to consider. And these three key numbers across the middle are what actually matters. It's the outcomes, not just the outputs. It's how the kids are performing. The fact that in a pencils of promise community versus a non-pencils of promise community, our students see 3-time increase in test scores. About 85% of the communities that we work in report increases in literacy. And in rural Ghana, whereas 30 to 40% of kids progress from primary to secondary school, we see a 96% progression rate when we have our scholarship programs in place. And fortunately, the organization has won accolades and recognition from some of the greatest institutions on earth. But that's not really what this talk is about. It's actually about this question that I've been asked relentlessly for the last 2 years, which is, how will we educate children in the future? And that question always has a slight tilt whenever I hear it, because there's an underlying tone which often comes out, which is, how about educating our kids here at home? Right? I'm sure each of you are interested in that question. Why do you go out into these parts of the developing world, Laos, Guatemala, Ghana, Nicaragua, when we have so many issues here at home? And again, the more that I started to inquire about why people were asking me that question, I heard this answer, which was, well, if we can better educate our kids here, then maybe we can teach them something in the developing world that would be useful. What if we asked a different question? What if we asked, what can the US education system learn from the developing world? Right? What if some of the solutions to the way that we educate our kids at home are unlocked in the areas where the greatest innovation can push forward with the least resistance, which from what I've seen is in communities on rural countrysides? So that's really what I want to talk about today. And there's 3 things that we've been able to unearth that I think will be very, very fascinating for the way that we think about educating kids here at home. So the first one is that when you think about a traditional classroom in the United States, you're told over and over and over as a kid, pay attention, stop fidgeting, sit in your desk. And yet in the developing world, when you see how kids are educated, oftentimes they don't have the proper desks. So kids are standing up, they're sitting down, they're moving around a classroom. In between classes, they get up, they go outside, they play by the river, right? Motion is an essential part of a day-to-day activity in a classroom in the developing world. Now, when you look at the data behind that, what we see is that a brain, when sitting quietly, is not nearly as activated as a brain that has just gone through a little bit, only a 20-minute walk, but a small amount of physical activity. So that's the first one, is this idea that motion leads to devotion. And maybe we need to rethink the way that we educate kids when it comes to physical activity, not just during playtime in these restricted playgrounds, but how do we get them to truly move in the room? So the second idea is this question around how do we better educate kids through literacy. And oftentimes, we think about reading as purely the act of a piece of paper, scanning eyes from one side to the other. But the reality is that literacy is actually the conversion of a symbol into a sound. That's it. And our brain has the ability to process both separately and simultaneously visual and auditory stimulation. But what about a third element? What about spatial recognition? What about movement of body? And so what we're now piloting and seeing incredible results around is usage of sign language for literacy skills for early childhood development. Getting kids engaged, right? If you've ever seen a kid in a classroom, the hardest thing is to get them excited. But you watch a kid learning sign language, that's a kid who's learning, truly, truly, through education. And then the third one is the idea of the teacher, right? So this is one of our teachers in Guatemala, and when you think about a teacher in a classroom, you have this traditional image of wise educator standing in front of a room of young children. But in the developing world, they often don't have enough teachers. Or what you see is children who are unsupervised by parents. And what happens? The 8-year-old teaches the 6-year-old. And I don't know about you guys, but when I was in college, the courses that I mastered most were those that I had to teach to others. That became my actual study method, was I taught one of my friends the course, and then he would teach me a different area in return. That's when we mastered skills. And so the third idea that we should start to incorporate in the way that we educate our kids at home is that children learn best through teaching, child-centered learning. The question isn't just, what do we want them to learn? How do we want them to learn? But what type of people do we want to create? The idea is that this for-purpose concept is not the bottom of the nonprofit spectrum. It's a different axis altogether. Nonprofit, non-purpose businesses, they're going to go away. For-purpose ones that have a nonprofit tax structure, they'll stick around. Non-purpose for-profit businesses, I call them dinosaurs because at one point in time, dinosaurs ruled the earth, and now they are no more because the environment around them changed. And then ultimately, for-profit, for-purpose will continue to succeed. But when you look at this chart, the key takeaway is the left side is no more. If you are not building a business that is based on purpose, if you are not creating a life that is based on purpose, your business will erode. We have to ask ourselves, do we want to live lives of success, or do we want to live lives of significance? And what do we tell our children when it comes to the type of life that they want to create? My answer is one in which they dream big. They dream to the point of audacity and fear. Because ultimately, in the words of Alan Johnson Sirleaf, if your dreams do not scare you, then they are not big enough. Thank you so much.